The observation deck of the Indomitable was quiet, save for the rhythmic clicks of claws on polished alloy floors. Admiral Varkesh stood with his hands clasped behind his back. Golden eyes narrowed as he surveyed the swirling clouds of Earth. The blue and green marble hung silently before him, unassuming. He snorted, a sound sharp enough to make the nearest officer flinch. Primitive, fragile, and yet they had resisted. "Tell me, Commander," Varkesh said, not turning his gaze from the viewport. "How is it that a race still slinging projectiles at one another has managed to delay our progress by 2 planetary cycles?" Commander Threx stiffened beside him, pale scales glimmering under the cool artificial light. "The terrain is complex, Admiral. Their settlements are vast ruins, twisted metal, crumbling stone. Our mechanized legions find it difficult to navigate." Excuses. Varkesh's voice was quiet, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. He finally turned, his long frame moving with predatory grace. "We have eradicated civilizations that span solar systems. We have broken species that master gravity itself. And here we are, stumbling in the dirt because we underestimate bipeds who barely escape their own atmosphere." Threx bowed his head lower. "It will be corrected, Admiral." "See that it is?" Varkesh said, moving past him. His cape swept the floor in a harsh line as he exited. "They are vermin. They must be treated as such." The command deck was alive with data streams and status reports as Varkesh entered, the crew snapping to rigid attention. He waved them down, his eyes flicking to the holographic map of the battlefield. Earth's North American continent blinked with red indicators. Resistance clusters, sniper positions, mining points where the humans had sabotaged Empire landing zones. They were not holding ground in the traditional sense. No formations, no battle lines. Just chaos. And that chaos was costing him soldiers. Captain Zorn awaited him at the center dais, armored and coiled like a spring. His crimson crest feathers were bound back in a warrior's braid. Ceremonial, but his hands flexed with anticipation. "Admiral," Zoran said, "my squads are prepared. Give the word, and we will sweep Sector 9 clean." Varkesh studied the captain. Young by their standards. Hungry for glory. Reckless. "You find this amusing." Zoran's mandibles clicked in what passed for a smile. "They are an annoyance. If they had faced our legions openly, they would already be subjugated. But they hide. Cowards. Cowards who killed General Vakir," Varkesh replied sharply, with a single shot, through 6 centimeters of composite armor. He let the words hang there, watching Zorn's expression falter. "One of our best strategists. Executed like livestock. An anomaly," Zoran said, recovering quickly. "They cannot replicate such precision." Varkesh studied him a moment longer, then slowly nodded. "Good. Then you will flush out this anomaly." He gestured toward the map. "The human they call Hunter." Zorn inclined his head. "As you command." The meeting dispersed with efficiency, captains and aides hurrying to their tasks. Varkesh lingered a moment longer by the map, his gaze fixed on a single blinking point in Sector 9. A kill zone, they'd called it, the place where their patrols vanished. 3 squads, 32 soldiers, gone. Slaughtered by a single marksman. He exhaled through his teeth, claws tapping the edge of the console. "Hunter," he murmured, as if tasting the name. The surface of old Chicago was a graveyard of steel and glass. Towering ruins reached crooked fingers toward a smoke-hazed sky, their shadows long and cold. Dax Hunter lay prone atop the skeleton of an ancient skyscraper, his rifle steady on its bipod. The weapon was old, almost antique by military standards. Bolt action, manual load, but it was precise, untraceable by enemy sensors. And in his hands, it was death incarnate. He adjusted the scope with slow, deliberate movements. A patrol was moving through the debris below, 6 figures in gleaming alloy armor, their formation tight. Good discipline. He respected that. He also knew it wouldn't save them. Breath in, exhale half. Pause. The crosshairs settled over the lead soldier's visor. Range, 1,200 meters. Wind, negligible. Target, unaware. He squeezed the trigger. The supersonic crack of the shot echoed off the hollow towers. The soldier's helmet exploded in a mist of blue-gray ichor. Before the others reacted, Dax had already cycled the bolt, chambered another round. Panic. They broke formation. Another shot, second soldier down. The remaining scattered, seeking cover behind crumbling walls. It wouldn't help them. He shifted position, crawling 3 meters left, minimizing his exposure. Third shot. A trooper who thought he was safe behind reinforced concrete took the round through a broken window. He waited then, watching survivors through his scope. Fear made them sloppy. One bolted, breaking from cover, hoping speed would save him. It didn't. 4 down. He watched the fifth one hunker down and start transmitting. A distress call, no doubt. Dax keyed his comms briefly, intercepting. The ghost! He's here. Sniper in the ruins. We need evac now. Dax let him call for help. Let them come. He eased back from the scope and began his crawl toward the next position. Captain Zoran's squad arrived an hour later, fanning out through the ruins with weapons at the ready. They moved with precision, overlapping fields of fire, scanning in infrared and ultraviolet. Drones buzzed overhead, mapping heat signatures. They found the bodies quickly, stripped of weapons and comm gear. Their chests had been marked with crude human glyphs. Letters. Zoran scowled. What does it say? One of his soldiers asked. Zoran tilted his head, trying to remember the human tongue. 1 shot, 1 kill. A challenge. He ground his teeth together, mandibles flexing. Sweep the area. Leave nothing standing. They moved out, 2 squads pushing toward opposite ends of the kill zone. Drones scanned every crevice, but there was nothing. No human heat signatures. No movement, until the first drone detonated. Trap. Zoran barked, but was too late. Explosions echoed through the ruins. Improvised mines buried under rubble. 2 soldiers disappeared in the blast. A third screaming through the comms as his leg vanished below the knee. Hunter! One of them shouted. It's him. Zoran cursed and regrouped his remaining troops. Tightened ranks. Eyes up. But he felt it already. Fear creeping into their discipline. Another shot rang out. A soldier dropped, his helmet cord clean through. The squad returned fire, spraying plasma bursts at the sniper's last known position. Smoke and dust filled the air. They advanced, weapons hot. The ruin was empty. He's moving, Zoran muttered. Like a shadow, he activated his personal scanner, cycling through frequencies. Nothing. No life signs. But the reports, they said he could mask himself, make himself invisible to their technology. Old tricks. Low-tech solutions they hadn't anticipated. He hated low-tech. It was dirty, unreliable, and effective. Another shot. Another soldier down. They fell back under cover of smoke grenades, Zoran cursing the entire way. His comm buzzed. Report. Varkesh's voice rasped. Engaged, Zoran snapped. Hunter is here. Status. Zoran wiped a smear of blood from his visor. We are regrouping. A pause. Then, do not fail me, Captain. The line went dead. Zoran signaled for a perimeter lockdown. They would draw the human out, bait him. He set decoys, heat emitters mimicking body signatures. Placed them in vulnerable positions, exposed, tempting. Then he waited. Hunter did not take the bait. Hours passed. Zoran's soldiers grew restless, jumpy. He saw them flinch at shadows, saw the way they gripped their weapons tighter. He knew the signs of men unraveling. A report came in. A supply convoy, 3 clicks east, wiped out. Clean kills. No survivors. Zoran's got twisted. The sniper was already gone. High above, from a different rooftop, Dax watched through a scope. He saw the Empire soldiers pacing, nervous. He noted their decoys. He smiled faintly. They were learning, but too slowly. He recorded the data, patterns of movement, fields of fire, response times. It would help when he came back. For now, he pulled back, blending into the ruins. He had another target. An Empire general was inbound. High value, worth the risk. He disappeared into the concrete wasteland, silent as a grave. Varkesh stood on the bridge once more, staring at the planet below. He clenched his clawed hand behind his back, feeling the tight coil of frustration in his chest. This was not how it was supposed to go. They do not fight with honor, Commander Threx said quietly beside him. Varkesh didn't look at him. Honor? No, they fight to survive. Threx hesitated. What should we do? Varkesh's eyes gleamed. We adapt, as they have. But in his gut, he wondered if they were already too late. Dax Hunter crouched low against the jagged concrete, one glove hand pressed to the fractured edge of a shattered highway overpass. His breathing was slow, controlled, each inhalation measured against the weight of his rifle slung across his shoulder. The ruins around him were silent, as they always were before a kill. His eyes flicked over the landscape, reading it the way others might read a map, angles, elevations, sight lines. A sniper's scripture carved in crumbling steel and dust. The Empire had landed another transport overnight. He'd seen the black trails of its descent cut through the clouds just before dawn, and by mid-morning, fresh patrols were sweeping through the south side of the city ruins. The arrogance of it gnawed at him. They still thought this place was theirs to take, that they could hunt the last of humanity like pests. He slid down the embankment with practiced ease, his boots skimming loose gravel as he angled toward the hollow shell of what had once been a shopping mall. Broken glass crunched beneath his soles. His hands adjusted the weight of the rifle automatically as he passed the sagging entryway, slipping into the shadowed interior, where the Empire's optics would have to work harder to find him. A low static crackled in his ear. He tapped his earpiece, drawing a faint whisper from command. "Hunter, do you read?" "I'm here," he murmured. "Recon drone confirms. Another heavy squad is moving through Grid 7. Possible officer." Dax's eyes narrowed. "Identification?" "No visuals, but chatter suggests high rank." He gave a brief nod that no one could see. "Moving." He moved quickly but silently, keeping to the dead spaces where the Empire's sensors were weakest. Dax had learned their blind spots over weeks of observation and trial by fire. His was a different war, fought in inches and shadows, not in armies and lines. That kind of war was over, had been since orbit fell. He didn't waste time mourning it. As he climbed the narrow stairwell of a collapsed parking structure, he ran the calculations in his head: wind vectors, distance, timing. He had 3 rounds left in the mag. Each was hand-loaded back at the last fallback point, each one calibrated precisely. There would be no backup. He didn't need it. At the top level, he went prone, belly to the cold, cracked concrete. The rifle came up, his cheek settling against the worn stock. Through the scope, he saw them, Empire troopers. 9 of them in a wedge formation. Their armor gleamed even under the dust-heavy sky, silver and black in crimson sigils painted over their shoulder plates. He tracked them as they moved through an open square. They weren't worried about cover. They didn't think anything down here could touch them. But there was something different this time. The figure in the center walked without the heavy, methodical step of a standard trooper. The armor was lighter, but the insignia on his breastplate marked him as something more. An officer. Dax steadied his breathing and adjusted the scope. The officer's helmet had a different configuration. More sensors, more optics. Probably had better range-finding gear than Dax could dream of. But all the technology in the galaxy didn't make you faster than a bullet. He slowed his heartbeat with practice control. His finger brushed the trigger guard. The squad paused, scanning the horizon. One of them tilted his helmet toward the parking structure. Dax froze. He waited. The trooper raised a hand. They were running a sweep, he realized. It was standard, not a reaction to him. But they were close to spotting him anyway. He exhaled slowly, aligning the crosshairs. The officer turned his head at just the wrong time. Dax squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the hollow ruins. The officer's helmet splintered, and his body snapped backward as if yanked by an invisible hand. The formation faltered. Dax was already cycling the bolt, his second round chambered. 2 of the soldiers dropped to a knee, forming a defensive wedge around the fallen officer. Others fanned out. They moved faster this time. Not panic, but methodical. Dax's second shot punched through a trooper's shoulder joint, dropping him instantly. He didn't waste time confirming. The squad went for cover, but there was little of it in the open plaza. One of them fired a flare into sky. Red smoke bloomed above the square, marking the position. They were calling in reinforcements. Dax let his scope sweep right. He found another trooper running to flank. Too slow. The third shot took him in the hip joint, spinning him down hard. 3 shots, 3 kills. Mag empty. He rolled back from a rifle, sliding it into its sheath. He was already moving before the sound of his last shot faded. Empire dropships would be closing in. He had maybe 3 minutes before they blanketed the area with scanner sweeps and pulse rounds. He sprinted through the parking structure, boots silent on cracked cement, down 2 flights, then out through a jagged hole in the wall where rebar speared out like rusted claws. He was halfway across the next street when he heard the whine of repulsor engines. He ducked into a service tunnel just as a dropship thundered overhead. The concussion of its passage shook dust and debris from the ceiling. He crouched in the shadows, watching the heavy boots of fresh troopers hit the ground across the street. "Third officer down." A voice barked over the comms. "Spread out. We will find him." Dax moved deeper into the tunnel, water trickling beneath his feet. He passed the skeletal remains of old maintenance bots, scavenged long ago. The narrow passage opened into an old subway station. Broken rails glittered in the gloom. He knelt beside a rusted maintenance locker and opened it. Inside was a secondary rifle, shorter range, suppressed. He slung it over his shoulder. His main rifle had served its purpose. Now they'd be sweeping for snipers. He'd need to move differently. "Hunter." Command's voice whispered in his ear again. "Report." "Officer down," Dax murmured. "Enemy deploying reinforcements." "I'm relocating." "Copy." High Command confirms target priority shift. New intel places General Savric inbound to the surface. "If you can confirm landing zone, you are green." Dax closed his eyes briefly. Savric, one of the High Command. Brutal, efficient. If they were sending him down, they were rattled. That was good. "Send coordinates." Dax said, "Transmitting now." He checked the map overlay. 20 clicks south. A shattered industrial zone. Mostly open fields and collapsed structures. Hard to stay hidden. But there were always ways. He exhaled through his teeth and started moving. It took him the better part of an hour to navigate through the tunnels and broken streets. He bypassed 3 patrols and left behind 2 small explosive traps. They were set to trigger only if followed. He didn't waste energy engaging unnecessarily. Every shot, every move was deliberate. When he reached the outskirts of the industrial zone, he stopped and reconned from a crumbling silo. Through his scope, he saw the landing zone already marked by red beacons. A command post was being established nearby. 2 dropships on the ground, a third descending. Empire troops moved with disciplined efficiency, setting up perimeters. And there he was, Savric. Even at this distance, Dax recognized the arrogance in the general's posture. He moved without fear, issuing commands, gesturing toward defensive points. His armor was black, unlike the usual silver the Empire ranks. Custom, expensive, but not invulnerable. Dax checked his range. 1,800 meters. Wind at 4 knots from the west. Target in motion. Difficult, but not impossible. He set the rifle down and unfolded the bipod. His breathing slowed. He waited. Savric paused near an uplink station. An aide approached, holding a datapad. The general's helmet tilted as he reviewed it. Still, motionless. Dax fired. The round took 2 seconds to reach its mark. Savric's head snapped back. The aide beside him jerked in shock as the general crumpled, a spray of black ichor painting the wall behind him. Chaos. The command post erupted in movement. Sirens blared. Troopers rushed to secure the area. Scanners pinging in every direction. Dax was already moving, slipping back from the edge, rifle in hand. He packed up in under 15 seconds, his body on automatic. He ghosted down the silo's interior ladder, boots whispering against the rusted rungs. He didn't run. He walked. steady, disappearing into ruins again. Behind him, the Empire was screaming, shouting orders, scrambling to react. But they were too slow. He'd already chosen his next position, and they were still playing by rules that no longer applied. Dax slid into the hollow of an old maintenance shaft and let the silence wrap around him. His pulse was steady, though his muscles ached from the hours of movement. His breathing slowed, syncing with the faint rhythm of dripping water somewhere deeper in the tunnel. He checked the display on his wrist. 40 minutes since he'd taken the shot that killed General Saverick. Long enough for the Empire to scour the ruins above, but not long enough for their rage to burn out. He smirked faintly in the darkness. They would be tearing apart every corner of the surface now, searching for a ghost. They'd find nothing. They never did. Still, this time was different. He reached for his secondary rifle, running his fingers along the well-worn stock as he listened. Dax didn't believe in luck, but he believed in instinct, and his gut told him the Empire wasn't going to back down this time. They weren't sending just another officer. No, he'd crossed a line. He'd made them bleed. And men like Saverick didn't die quietly. There would be consequences. The calm in his ear crackled softly. He tapped it once. "Hunter," came the voice. "You're off the grid." "Deliberate," Dax answered quietly. "They've locked down the airspace. No chance for an extraction." "We're aware." Satellite sweep picked up new movement. Heavy deployment inbound. "Type." A pause. Then, "They're bringing in a Praetorian." The word hung there, cold and heavy. Dax closed his eyes briefly. Of course they were. Praetorians weren't officers. They weren't soldiers. They were the Empire's executioners. One man, clad in power armor, carrying the weight of an entire battlefield on his back. Their kind didn't hunt armies. They hunted men. Specific men. Dax understood then that he wasn't just a target anymore. He was a message. "ETA," he asked, voice low. 2 hours. Maybe less. He rolled his shoulders, working out the stiffness. "I'll be ready." "You're not expected to engage," the voice cautioned. "This is recon only." Dax didn't bother answering. He killed Saverick. The Praetorian would be looking for him. There was no place far enough to hide. So he wouldn't hide. He moved through the tunnels, careful not to leave a trace. Every few meters he planted small charges, proximity sensors, and tripwires. None of them would stop what was coming, but they might slow it down. They might buy him enough time to make the shot count. When he emerged into the low light of the surface again, he was at the outskirts of what had once been a power relay station. It loomed like a skeleton, twisted metal and concrete veins tangled against the dusk. He chose a vantage point high on a collapsed tower, crawling into place with methodical care. His rifle settled into the cradle of his shoulder as if it belonged there, as if it had grown from the same bones and blood. Through the scope, he scanned the horizon. At first, there was nothing, just wind and ash swirling over broken earth. Then, a shape emerged, tall, deliberate, and wrong. It walked without haste, as though time bent to its convenience. The armor was black, burnished, and smooth, without the sharp edges of the Empire's rank and file. It gleamed faintly in the dying light, a reflection of something cold and inhuman. The Praetorian. Dax watched it move with calculated grace. No escort, none needed. Its helmet turned slowly, as if it could sense the breath of the world, hear the shift of molecules around it. He kept his finger away from the trigger. Shooting now would be useless. He needed it to get closer. He needed to know what it was, what it could do. The Praetorian stopped in the center of the clearing and lifted something from its belt. A small, spherical drone. It released the device into the air. Dax tracked it as it rose in a smooth arc, scanning with pulses that made the hairs on his neck bristle. He adjusted his position slightly, minimizing his silhouette. The drone swept past his location without pause. Then the Praetorian turned and looked directly at him. Dax didn't flinch. He steadied his breathing, checked his scope again. The shot wasn't there yet. The angle was wrong. The armor wouldn't break at this range. He waited. The comm crackled again. "Hunter, you're compromised. Relocate now." "I'm staying," he replied quietly. "He knows where I am." Evac point 2. Negative. He shut the comm off. He couldn't afford the distraction. If this was going to end, it would end here. The Praetorian began to move, but not toward him. Instead, it crouched, pressing a gauntlet hand to the earth. A low hum rippled through the ground, vibrating up through the tower's ruined skeleton. Dax felt it in his teeth. Then the explosives he'd planted behind him detonated in a chain reaction. Dax dropped flat as debris and flame roared past. He rolled, sliding down the side of the tower, landing hard but on his feet. His rifle stayed with him. His movements were automatic now, muscle memory and survival stitched together. He sprinted for the next cover, an old storage container, and ducked inside just as a bolt of energy seared through the space where his head had been. The interior stank of rust and mold. He ignored it, bracing the rifle against the open hatch and scanning for the target. The Praetorian was moving faster now. It closed distance with mechanical efficiency, the long rifle it carried tracking his position like a predator sniffing out wounded prey. Dax fired. The round pinged harmlessly off the Praetorian's shoulder plate. It didn't even slow. He switched ammo types, tungsten penetrators, and fired again. The second round hit the same shoulder, denting the armor but not breaching it. He needed a weak point. The joints. He waited. The Praetorian raised its rifle again. Dax fired at the elbow joint just as the enemy squeezed the trigger. His shot struck home. The Praetorian's arm jerked violently, its shot going wide and carving a molten line to the ground beside him. Dax didn't hesitate. He broke cover and ran, zigzagging through debris, closing distance. His rifle slung over his shoulder as he drew the sidearm from his thigh holster. The pistol was heavy, designed for close-quarters stopping power. He vaulted over the wreckage of an old transport and landed hard. The Praetorian was there. Up close, it was a wall of armor and cold intent. Its remaining hand swung in a backhand that caught Dax mid-dodge, sending him sprawling. His head rang, his vision fuzzed. He tasted blood. He forced himself to roll as a heavy boot slammed down where he'd been. Dax came up firing. 3 rounds punched into the Praetorian's thigh joint. The servo sparked, and the knee buckled slightly. It adjusted instantly, compensating for the damage, swinging its rifle one-handed toward him again. Dax threw himself forward, inside the weapon's arc. He slammed the muzzle of his pistol into the Praetorian's neck joint and fired twice. The armor split. A hiss of venting gas, and something like black ichor spurted out. The Praetorian reacted immediately, grabbing Dax by the front of his vest and hurling him backward through the air. He crashed into a pile of rubble, ribs screaming as they cracked. He gasped, forced himself up, his vision blurred, but he saw the Praetorian falter, its movements no longer smooth. It was hurt, not dead, but hurt. Dax forced his legs to move. He drew his combat knife as he closed the distance again. The Praetorian swung its rifle like a club. Dax ducked low, driving the knife up into the damaged neck joint. He twisted hard. The Praetorian staggered. It made a sound, low, guttural, almost human. It grabbed for him again, but its strength was failing. Dax yanked the knife free and drove in again, deeper. The machine man fell to its knees. Dax stepped back, breathing hard. His ribs felt like they were on fire. His fingers were numb. But he watched as the Praetorian toppled forward, motionless. He stood there, chest heaving, until the calm crackled to life again. Hunter. Status. He stared down at the ruin in front of him. Praetorian neutralized, he said quietly. A pause. Then confirm? Confirmed. Extraction team inbound. Hold position. He nodded, more to himself than anyone else. He slumped down beside the cooling corpse of his enemy, staring at the horizon as the faint glow of ships entered the upper atmosphere. But even as relief threatened to pull him under, he couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when it came, he'd be ready. The storm had broken by the time Dax stood at the edge of the landing platform, watching the shuttle's engines cool in the thin light of early dawn. His body ached. Every movement waited by the fight with the Praetorian, but there was no rest waiting for him here. He adjusted the sling holding his rifle across his back and kept his expression neutral as the extraction team approached in a tight formation. Weapons low but eyes sharp. The leader stepped forward first, a broad-shouldered man with a thick scar bisecting his left brow. His name was Renner. Dax had worked with him once, back before they both become something else. Ghosts moving in shadows while the rest of humanity fought for scraps in the light. "Hunter," Renner greeted, voice gravel dragged over steel. "We thought you were dead." "You're not the only one," Dax replied. Renner's gaze dropped to the inert form laid out behind Dax, half covered with an old tarp. The Praetorian's armor still glinted in places, though much it was scorched and cracked, with black ichor dried around the seams. "You did this alone?" Renner asked. Dax gave a slight nod. "He didn't give me a choice." Renner grunted, his expression unreadable. Command's already spinning it into a victory story. First confirmed Praetorian kill by a human sniper. "They're calling you a hero." Dax didn't respond. He wasn't interested in stories. He was interested in staying alive. And heroes, in his experience, didn't last long out here. They moved quickly after that, securing the body and preparing for departure. Dax kept his eyes on the sky, searching the thin blue for signs of movement. The quiet after a kill never sat right with him. It was too still, too easy. As the shuttle lifted them toward orbit, he found himself seated near the rear, his hands restless in his lap. Renner sat across from him, arms folded over his chest. "You did more than kill a symbol down there," Renner said after a time. "You rattled them." Dax tilted his head. "Waiting," Renner continued, his voice quieter. "We intercepted comm traffic after you took out Saverick. They're scared. They're calling in reserves from their core systems. They're consolidating forces. The Empire isn't used to fear." Dax met his gaze. "Fear makes people dangerous. It also makes them stupid." He wasn't so sure about that. The Empire's stupidity hadn't kept them from nearly wiping humanity off the map. But he held his tongue. The shuttle systems chirped softly, and moments later, the stars stretched and warped as they made the jump. For the first time in days, Dax let out a slow breath. He leaned back against the bulkhead, closing his eyes, if only to rest them for a few moments. When he woke, it was the hum of a larger ship, a capital-class carrier by the sound of the engines. He was led through a series of wide corridors and finally into a briefing room that smelled of stale air and old metal. Command brass sat waiting at the far end of the long table, their uniforms crisp despite the obvious fatigue on their faces. The highest-ranking officer, Admiral Coron, gestured for him to sit. Dax did, saying nothing. He preferred it that way. Coron studied him a moment before speaking. "Your actions on Erythra secured more than a tactical victory. You've shifted the balance." Dax kept his expression neutral. "One kill doesn't win a war." "It depends on who you kill," Coron said simply. He folded his hands on the table. "The Empire has recalled several frontline fleets. They put resources into hunting you instead of crushing resistant cells. You've bought us time." Dax wasn't interested in the politics of it. He wasn't a strategist. He was a marksman. He pointed his weapon, and things died. Simple. "What's next?" he asked instead. Coron exchanged glances with the others at the table. Then he keyed a display on the wall. A map of Imperial space unfolded in front of them, dotted with clusters of hostile fleets and planetary holdings. "There's an opportunity," Coron said. "The Empire has a weak point: command and control centers. They're hard to hit, heavily defended, but they're vulnerable if you can get inside." Dax studied the map. "You want me to infiltrate one?" Coron nodded. "We need someone who can get close, get inside, plan a kill shot." It was a suicide mission. Dax knew it without needing to hear more, but he also knew there wasn't anyone else they would send. His reputation now preceded him. He was a sniper who killed a Praetorian and an Imperial general. They wouldn't waste a team on something they believed one man could do. He leaned back slightly. "Where?" The map zoomed in. A world called Alani's Prime. Deep in Imperial territory, but not a fortress world. Its significance wasn't military. It was political. The Empire's leaders gathered there. And during their next summit, they'd all be in one place. "The target is a man named Veclin," Coron said. He's a strategist. He designed the campaigns that wiped out half our colonies. You take him out, the Empire loses its brain. Dax nodded slowly. And the others? Collateral, Karan said, his tone flat. You kill Veclan. Anything beyond that is a bonus. There was silence for a moment. Then Dax rose to his feet. Send me the data. Karan's gaze flicked to a junior officer, who handed Dax a data slate. The plan was already in place. Routes, entry points, guard rotations. They'd been planning this for weeks. They just needed someone to pull the trigger. He left the room soon after. The corridors seemed quieter as he walked back toward the barracks assigned to him. Soldiers passed him without comment, though some of them stared. He could feel it now, the weight of expectation pressing against his shoulders. It wasn't unfamiliar, but it was heavier than it used to be. In his quarters, he unpacked his gear methodically. His rifle was cleaned, reassembled, and recalibrated. He checked every seam on his combat suit, adjusted the suppressors on his boots, and made sure his secondary weapons were in perfect working order. He worked until his hands stopped shaking. Later, Renner found him sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at nothing. You don't have to do this alone, Renner said. Dax glanced at him. It's not about having to. Renner studied him for a long time. Then he nodded once and left without another word. The next day, Dax boarded a stealth insertion ship bound for Alani's Prime. The crew said nothing to him. They didn't need to. He was cargo, a weapon wrapped in flesh, delivered to where it could do the most damage. The descent was smooth. He dropped from low orbit in a single-man pod that burned hot and fast through the atmosphere. He landed hard in the outskirts of the capital city, moving quickly to blend into the shifting crowds. The Empire's heart was polished steel and glass, its towers reaching for clouds streaked with crimson light. He moved like he belonged there, his false identification flawless, his demeanor calm. He was another face in a sea of obedient citizens. But beneath his coat, he carried death. For 2 days, he watched the compound. He memorized the routines, the shifting patterns of guards, the way the sun cast shadows at different hours. He found his vantage point, a maintenance shaft on an adjacent tower. From there, he could see into the great hall where the summit would take place. The day of the meeting, he climbed into position well before dawn. He waited motionless, his breath slow and steady. His rifle rested on its bipod, aimed and ready. When the Empire's leaders gathered, he picked them out one by one. Veclan was easy to spot, older than Dax had expected, his thin face and sharp eyes scanning the room with restless calculation. He wore no uniform, just simple robes of state. Dax exhaled slowly. His finger tightened on the trigger. One shot. Veclan dropped. A hole burned through his skull. Chaos erupted in the chamber. Guards scrambled for cover. Alarms blared, and windows polarized instantly. But it was too late. Dax was already moving, dismantling his rifle, securing it in the pack on his back. He moved quickly, slipping through access tunnels and maintenance corridors, his exit already planned. By the time the Empire knew what had hit them, he was gone. Hours later, as he drifted through orbit in another stolen shuttle, the news spread like wildfire. Veclan was dead. The summit had turned into a slaughter. Some of the Empire's highest leaders gunned down in the confusion. Dax stared out the viewport at the stars. The war wasn't over. Not yet. But they were afraid now, and fear was something he could use.